Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar session. It's hosted by the Georgia chapter of HFMA. I'm Laurie Hebe. I'm a Georgia HFMA Education Committee volunteer. A quick announcement before we get started here. I wanted to let you guys know that our annual fall conference is typically held in Savannah. Now we'll be conducting it virtually. The Education Committee is working on the agenda and more details are coming soon, so please be on the lookout for that. And another reminder, just please remember to bookmark the Georgia HFMA website, particularly the events calendar. You'll find a host of activities that are designed for education, continuing education, as well as networking. And the calendar is expanded, so not only do you see all the Georgia chapter activities, but you see the rest of Region 5 as well. Here are just a few housekeeping items. All of the phone lines are on mute to avoid interruptions during the broadcast. Please do submit your questions via the question box at any time, and I'll coordinate with Ross for his answers at the end of the presentation. Okay, and I am now sending in the chat. If you look in the chat box, you'll see a download link for today's presentation. And we'll also have the recording posted there later this week. Everyone on today's call is eligible to receive continuing education credits for participating, and you'll get that form in email. I'll be sending it again, so it'll come from my email address. It's lhevy@clearbalance.org. I'll be sending that Friday morning, and you can self-submit that form on the HFMA website under the membership info tab. And finally, before we get started with today's session, I'd like to take a second to recognize and thank our chapter sponsors, whose logos you can see on the screen now. We appreciate your support. Today's topic is entitled Delivering Massive Financial Impact in Revenue Cycle with Artificial Intelligence. Our speaker, Ross Moore, has more than 10 years experience in revenue cycle improvement and optimization. Prior to his current role as General Manager of Revenue Cycle at Olive, he held leadership roles at Accenture and Huron Consulting Groups. He received his bachelor's degree in finance from the University of Notre Dame and his MBA from the University of Chicago. Ross, we're ready to begin.
Thank you so much, Lori. And thank you everybody for joining today's webinar. Looking forward to spending the next hour with you talking about how to use artificial intelligence and automation within your revenue cycle. A couple things just wanted to mention. So with my role at Olive, I'm General Manager of Revenue Cycle Solutions, so responsible for our overall revenue cycle product offering suite around automations. But before joining Olive, as Lori was mentioning, I served leadership roles at Accenture and other consultant groups where I was helping health systems be able to adopt automation technologies and then scale them internally. So I'm able to provide a good perspective of all the different types of automation approaches that you can take, regardless of where you are in your automation journey. So for today's meeting, just wanted to keep it, be more high level and be able to just, again, talk about those different approaches that you can take and what are some of the benefits of each of those different mechanisms. So a few things we want to cover today. Again, how do you choose what is the best automation and AI partner that makes sense for your organization based off of your goals and your priorities? Next thing is how to use a data-driven approach to really be able to mine as well as prioritize which processes truly are going to be the best ones for your organization to focus on. In order to have a successful automation program, it is really important to have a great change management program that's going to make sure that you're engaging your staff, you're invigorating them, they're excited about it, and they see it as more of an opportunity versus a threat. And then kind of along those lines, it's important to make sure that you're getting the right internal alignment within your team and getting buy-in across the organization, not just with your staff members that are going to be helping to kind of design those processes to be automated, but also just as importantly is making sure you're engaging the right folks from IT and from your finance leadership team to make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page about the program and how to really make it be the most successful. So just to help kind of gauge where the audience is and which learning objectives are most important to you, did just want to start off with this polling question and get some feedback from the group on again, which of these is the most important for you. So we'll give the group a maybe about 30 seconds here, if that, to go ahead and fill this out. All right, so we're getting some good results so far. It looks like, oh, it's shifting a little bit. It was first starting off with A, most folks were wanting that, but now it's shifting more towards B. So I think we can go ahead and close this one out and share the results with the group. Looks like a good distribution across the first, the second, and the third, but really focusing on that data-driven approach to make sure you're prioritizing and identifying the optimal processes. So we have a whole section that's dedicated to that today. We'll make sure that we're focusing on that for the majority of our time with the group. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit, I'm sure that especially the operators and the Rev Cycle folks that are on the line know this all too well, but there's a number of challenges that is being experienced across the industry right now with complexity of workflows, and you may have staff turnover and having to constantly train those staff. And I know with COVID as well, being able to backfill and make sure you have the right staffing amounts, and issues with reduced reimbursement that are coming across. So all of these different challenges really can be approached and alleviated when you have a robust automation program that's in place. But one thing that's really interesting is there's definitely a general consensus across the industry right now that AI and automation is really important to organizations in order to make sure that you're continuously improving and getting to the right margin requirements. So 94% of organizations believe that AI is going to give them that competitive advantage. But what's interesting is that about 50% of automation programs end up failing. So they're not able to deliver the ROI that they were really expected to deliver. And when we get into this more in detail throughout today's discussion, you'll see that a lot of the times that breaks down with either maybe not finding the right partner that doesn't necessarily have the best experience and knows how to build out the processes. And then also in tandem with that, making sure that you have the right internal alignment. So making sure you have the right governance structure in place and the right leaders that are engaged to help you really push your program along. The other thing that's interesting is when this study was performed, about 62% of organizations felt like they had a really strong AI strategy that was deployed, but only 13% of those organizations were able to actually take a point solution. So maybe it's initial pilot of doing automation and are able to scale that beyond that initial point solution. So today's discussion is really going to be focused on helping you, again, find that right partner and focus on the right processes and have that vision in place that's going to help you scale the program. As I was mentioning earlier, it is really, really important that you are finding the right partner, regardless of who that is, because there's no one size fits all that's going to be perfect. But one of the things that, if I could just kind of give my advice, is making sure that whoever you're working with, that they really do have experience. This is an interesting quote from Charlene Seidman, the VP of PFS over at Yale New Haven, but she was quoted recently saying, make sure that you find a company who shares the same goals as you. It's difficult because many companies are saying they've built something, but then when you actually get deeper into the conversation, they're actually looking for somebody to partner with that can kind of co-build this with them. And that's important because when you're kind of identifying and evaluating each of your different options, you want to make sure that whoever you're working with really does have deep experience. Because I can tell you, for example, on the Olive side, we've worked with 70 customers now, and the way that we were building our automations when we were working with customers 1 through 5 looks a lot different than what we're doing right now. So it is really important to kind of vet whoever it is you're talking with, speak with references, make sure that they have at least maybe 10 or so customers that they've worked across, ideally significantly more than that, but I know it's a kind of flourishing industry that we're in right now. But being able to get those references and make sure that whoever you're working with has a standard methodology they're using, has a tried and true process for quickly being able to deliver the solutions that you're discussing with them. Ways that you can make sure that your program is unlocking massive value. And I'm not going to read through all these. This is something that after the discussion and presentation today, I do recommend kind of either saving this slide off and revisiting it as you're in different phases of your automation journey. But let's say that you're in the beginning of that journey right now. And the first question to be really considering and thinking through is, do you want to build your own program? So that would be more in line with working with, let's say, a consulting company that they partner with companies like a UiPath or a Blue Prism or an Automation Anywhere, and they're basically teaching you how to build the bots and then scaling them internally. That has benefits, it has drawbacks, but that's one route you could take. Another one is being able to what we call buy, but purchasing AI as a service, where that partner is doing all of the different components of knowing which processes to automate, building the automations, maintaining those automations, and optimizing them over time. So those are the two most common flavors I see, where either folks are kind of working with a consulting company to help coach and equip them to use that capability, or it could be more of the fully baked AI as a service approach that Olive specializes in, as well as a couple of other folks. But if you are going to go down, as you're thinking about that and you're going down that route, think about what kind of resources do you have? So do you have the technical resources internally that you're going to be able to train to develop the bots? Do you have folks that are more like internal process consultants that can help you understand where there are opportunities to maybe streamline some of your processes? Switching over to scoping, making sure that you are performing the right diagnostics and testing to be able to figure out, which of the workflows are going to drive the most value. So that's something, again, we'll spend a little bit more time on. Maintaining becomes a really important consideration as well. So a lot of the times when these programs are failing, there is an underappreciation with the amount of effort that's truly going to be required to manage a bot. So let's say that when I'm using the term bot, it's a software application you're using, and you're training that application on what are the specific process clicks, the step-by-step activities that your teams are performing within a workflow. And those workflows change. The screens that your teams are working with, let's say they're going to payer portals, those could change, or within your EMR, like Epic or Cerner, those are constantly changing as well. So there is a pretty robust capability that you'll have to stand up to make sure that those are being maintained. And oftentimes the failure point becomes not having enough staff or the resources or expertise to do that maintenance. So different things to consider. One more polling question for the group. So think about total cost of ownership. So what are all the costs that are going to go into an automation program? What is your guess on the difference, the ratio between how much is spent on the technology itself? So that would be, the cost of a bot license, for example. It could be server requirements and setting up those the software and hardware that's required, versus the services around it. So that's maybe consulting costs and implementation, and then your internal team costs as well. So we'll leave this open for a few more seconds, but curious on what your guess is on that distribution. All right, it looks like the results are starting to stabilize. So we'll go ahead and pause there. So good distribution across the B, C, and D. Which is interesting. I mean, it does show that there's not a common thought on exactly what that split would be. But the answer comes down to what would that option be? It would be option D. So 23% of costs are associated with the technology, where 77% are more around those additional services. So Forrester is an industry leader with respect to doing market research. One of the things that they found that was a very interesting insight is that the hard technology costs are much lower in comparison to the additional costs around it. So for every dollar that was spent on that RPA software, roughly $3.41 were spent on making that work. So that's why, again, it's important to make sure that if you're thinking about kind of this build versus buy decision, that you're considering all the costs that are going to be required in order to really make sure that your program is successful. So a couple of takeaways from this section and with respect to getting your program started and figuring out who to partner with is one, making sure you do select somebody that has a lot of deep expertise. If you have questions and you want to talk through some of those different options, I'm more than happy to set up some time and chat with you. Other things are just making sure you're really weighing the total cost of ownership. So not just the technology costs that are going to be quoted to you, but thinking about what are all the other costs, whether it's consulting costs or hiring an additional project managers internally that's going to be required to make the program work. All those are important. And then also considering not just the cost, but also the value. So when you're talking with the partner that you're investigating, understand what kind of return have other customers gotten on their investment. So that way you can look at the big picture. So the next section is really focused on, again, making sure that you are using a data-driven approach. I mean, in this day and age where we are, and everybody's being forced to figure out how do they get more done with less people, and one of the ways you can do that is by leveraging automation. But you need to make sure that when you're doing automation, that you're really focusing on those automations that are going to, and the processes that are going to drive the most bang for your buck. And the way to do that is to be very diligent upfront and understanding the value case. So when you're looking at it, definitely starting off with this kind of 4-step process. Step one is prospecting. So this is something your partner should be able to help you out with. The more experienced partners will know, typically in Rev Cycle, these are the 5 to 10 top areas that you want to start off with, like authorizations or eligibility, or it could be around claim statusing and denials actioning, and specific denials in particular, like additional information required and itemized bills, things like that. Just being able to make sure that your partner knows these are the types of processes you should be focusing on, but then kind of supplementing those with maybe organization specific workflows where perhaps there are opportunities to streamline those. The second piece is getting into scoping. So being able to understand what that financial impact is of each of those different processes that you're looking into, and then being able to prioritize those on a roadmap based off of their complexity as well as their value that they're going to be anticipating. Then it actually gets into mapping. So once you say these are the processes we want to focus on, then going through and doing the detailed mapping and building out the plans to say this is exactly how the automation is going to work. And then the last piece comes to actually building those. So we'll go through this in a little bit more detail, but when it comes to using kind of that data-driven process and looking at partners that can help you drive the most value, this is something that we use internally within Olive, and we call creating the autonomous revenue cycle. So being able to help organizations understand how they can string multiple functions together to be able to really drive a ton of automation across your enterprise. So providing an example, kind of working across a few different buckets here, it could be being able to start off with automating some of their workflows around initial appointment scheduling. And then from there, once you have the appointment scheduled, then the next piece could kick off with eligibility. So checking to see what is this patient's insurance? Does this procedure, is it a covered benefit? If it is, then being able to kick off a new automation process around authorization. So determining if an auth is required, submitting that auth, statusing it. After that auth is obtained, being able to, let's say, skip into the billing side. Let's say you get a denial, then being able to have your AI and automation capability to be able to perform a first pass authorization appeal. Things like that, where that partner is able to kind of work with you on this roadmap and figure out how you can string multiple functions together to truly create that autonomous revenue cycle where the majority of the functions within kind of that step of a claim and the life cycle of the claim is truly being automated. When you're thinking about how to do this data-driven approach, similar to how consultants and your team will be working in leveraging, let's say, hfma benchmarks and using the map keys, that's definitely fundamental, and it should be a requirement as you're going through and thinking about what is the value going to be that your solution is offering. So one of the ways to do that is you can look at what are some of the best practice metrics around things like insurance verification, and where's your team there now versus that best practice, and quantifying how much impact is it going to make, and being able to bring you from current state to that best practice metric. Same thing with looking at your initial denials rate, and then that can help kind of figure out where there are opportunities to improve processes upstream using automation, or what percent of denials are you successfully appealing and getting to them, because I know that that can be a constant battle, is having the capacity to be able to have teams focus on all of the denied claims that you should be able to appeal, but not necessarily having the bandwidth and capacity to be able to get to all of those. So I mentioned this just to say that you can use those same kinds of KPIs to be able to understand where might there be the most opportunity to be able to use automation to get you to that best practice figure, and then quantifying that delta. The more experienced automation partners should be able to tell you as well, not just what is the value of getting you from current state to best practice, because that could be a more broad assumption, but rather what have their customers actually seen? What was their baseline figure in terms of maybe authorization write-offs, and after implementation, what has been the results that they've been actually able to achieve, and using that as some of your proxies as well for estimating how much opportunity there is from automating some of these different processes. So other things to keep in mind when you're using this data-driven approach to figure out what are going to be the best processes to automate. Typically you want to focus on things that have costly errors. So I mentioned authorization because I know that that is a constant challenge right now in the industry. There aren't a lot of great solutions around it historically to really solve the problem, but that is a perfect example of a very costly error. You miss that authorization opportunity, and you're not always able to get that retro auth and appeal that on the back end. Digital processes. So that's basically saying any process where there's discrete fields, and you're kind of working that within a workflow system. So working it within your EMR, for example, or managing it by having to go to payer websites. Processes that are handwritten in nature are just a little bit more difficult to automate and are not going to necessarily always provide as much bang for your buck compared to others. You have meaningful KPIs to value. So for example, if you're focusing on an automation that's going to help with patient engagement, that can be in patient satisfaction rather, that could be a value add, but it's a little bit more difficult to figure out exactly how that's going to improve your bottom line and be able to tie it to opportunities and to workflows that your automation is going to be able to tackle. High volume, low variability, those are also key characteristics of good process to automate, as well as anything that's resource intensive. So along those lines, you can basically take those different characteristics and be able to say, what is the value of being able to automate this process? And we typically think about it in these first two ways, with either there's a cost driver. So it could be that you have significant staff that's dedicated to manage a process, and you're able to eliminate some of the labor requirements that are needed to support that function, and then free up those staff members to perform other tasks. Other things could be overtime costs. That kind of ties back to the labor as well. Or it could be that you're outsourcing this function to a vendor, which you could actually have automation do instead of outsourcing. It could be that you're able to work with an automation vendor to do a function at a much cheaper cost than what you're able to do right now. So that would be on the cost side. And then on the net revenue side, we have this little tip down here, but typically we see about a 3-to-1 ratio between value that organizations get from net revenue lift as opposed to cost reduction. But that's actually improving your net revenue, and it could be through write-off avoidance and write-off reduction, or it could be through, let's say, like gross charge improvement. You can use artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms to be able to identify where there may be missing charges, and then automatically add those missing charges if they're justified. So that could be more of the top line revenue improvement. But again, typically most organizations will find it'll be somewhere around that 3-to-1 ratio between how much benefit you get from net revenue improvement versus cost reduction. There are other areas where you'll get benefits too with respect to cash acceleration, patient satisfaction, some patient leakage. Cash Excel, I'm sure everybody knows this, but that's something to be taken with a grain of salt because it is a one-time benefit as opposed to a recurring benefit that you'd be getting. But all these tying back to the topic of using a data-driven approach, that you want to make sure that you're looking at the full value and spectrum of value that you should be anticipating to get from using automation. So whether it's a cost reduction or net revenue or some of these other factors, being able to quantify those and keep them in mind. So this is where we want to kind of bring it to life a little bit, just along the thread of authorization management that I've been mentioning earlier. One of the automations that you could do is having a bot check all those upcoming visits and appointments to be able to figure out which of those require an authorization or not. We've been able to find that typically it's usually somewhere between 60 to 70% of scheduled procedures do not require an auth. So if your team is spending time going through and figuring out, does this require or not, that could be a significant impact, not just for time savings, but also factoring in the quality as well, where humans will periodically make mistakes, and that could result in revenue leakage at the end of the line. So the bot can then first do that initial pass to figure out, does this require an auth or not? And then compiling a list of those appointments. Let's say you're using Epic, we can filter out anything that does not require an auth, so that way that list of procedures remaining are just the ones that do. Then staff member could submit that authorization request to the vendor. We do have some capabilities on the Olive side to automate that submission as well, but this would be just representative example of a person doing it. The next thing is, after that auth has been submitted to the payer, being able to perform the regular checks with that payer to understand, has this auth been obtained or not? And then if it has, being able to pull that information back into the EMR. That way you can make sure that the auth number is included in the claim when you're submitting it, and you're making sure that you're not getting that denial. Doing things like taking screenshots and being able to provide the documentation and evidence that an auth was obtained. Other things you can do using bots as well. So that's just a very simple example of how you can use automation within an authorization process to first check if an auth is required. You can actually, it's not represented here, but automate the submission to the payer, and then be able to do the status checks to be able to determine, is this auth obtained or not? That way also, it gives you the opportunity to impact those requests where an auth isn't obtained. So let's say, for example, you have external physician groups that are referring into your health system that are expected to manage their own authorizations because they have all the clinical documentation. If you're using the status check process, it can give you visibility to know, oh, this authorization request is still pending. Maybe it had to go to peer-to-peer review, and you're waiting for that external physician to be able to kind of take action on it to get it approved. At least you can know where that's standing by using these status types, and then be able to, if you need to, follow up with the patient and reschedule the service to be able to provide enough time to get that authorization, or give them the option to sign like a notice of non-coverage or an ABN. So kind of wrapping that up with respect to that data-driven approach to finding the right processes, keep in mind that not all processes are going to be created equal. Some processes are going to deliver a lot more bang for the buck than others, and you want to make sure that you're doing that value case ahead of time. Keep in mind the value is created both from net revenue and from costs, and just realizing that experience matters when you're mining for the right processes. So making sure you're working with your partner to understand really what is the feasibility, because there are a number of processes that could be automated, but it's keeping in mind how long is that build time going to be to get this live. What are the exceptions we need to take into consideration? So what percent do you think that your bot could take versus what percent may be kicked out to our team members that have to review those? Asking those questions and making sure you can take that into consideration for your business case before it gets approved by a more formal governance committee. So the next section is really focused again on kind of change management and what are the important considerations of change management. There was an interesting study that was done by Ernst & Young around RPA, robotic process automation. And what they found is that 50% of RPA projects ended up failing. And the reason for that, again, we'll kind of get into it here, is typically coming down to a couple different things. But change management is one of the main reasons, and making sure that you have the right stakeholders engaged across your organization, and you're also engaging your staff members to be able to help you build those automations that are going to reduce some of the, we call it taking the robot out of the human, but reduce some of the monotonous, time-intensive, repetitive tasks that they're having to perform. So when we think about change management, there are really 4 different pillars to be keeping in mind. The first of which is around having a really robust and thoughtful communication strategy. So, for example, being able to say to your staff and to your teams that this is an organizational imperative. We want to focus, and we need to focus on automation because we're experiencing challenges of declined reimbursement and increased write-offs, for example, or pressure from our executive team to be able to get more lean. And so explaining that that is the imperative behind this, but being able to make sure that staff feel at ease. Regardless of automation, there's always going to be room in any organization for your top performers, and you want to make sure that you're engaging them and are giving them more challenging work that helps them feel enriched and passionate about the job that they're doing. So helping them understand that this is actually presenting opportunities for staff to be able to take on different kinds of functions and help the organization achieve the objectives. But explaining, what are those expectations going to be? A lot of organizations, they'll kind of, if let's say you have a process that requires 50 people to do, and through automation, you're able to take out 30% of the staffing requirements for it, helping folks understand that it's not like overnight there's going to be people that are losing their jobs. It's more so managed through attrition, for example, and ensuring that if there is a better way to repurpose those staff members to take on other workflows, like maybe it's allowing somebody to do more denials management because your team doesn't have enough staffing there. Just talking through that and being very upfront and honest, so that way staff, they truly understand how this could impact them at the end of the day, and they feel a little bit better and more at ease and are not feeling threatened by it. Being able to do things like in your communication strategy, again, outline those expectations, explain why you're doing the program, be able to make sure that you're having a consistent cadence and around how you're sharing the results of the program with the different stakeholders and team members that are involved. Governance becomes really important as well. I'll flash up an example governance model, but making sure you have that executive sponsorship that can help you as you're trying to figure out and give the kind of that final approval on which automations do you want to focus on first. Being able to help get the alignment between requirements, let's say both between operations and IT. There may be needs for your IT or IS group to help develop some extracts that would be used in the automations, or maybe there's an opportunity to help streamline some of your work queues where your bots are taking some and people are taking others. So things like that, and by having executive sponsorship and engagement up top helps to be able to get alignment in terms of prioritizing your roadmap and the automations you want to focus on. Other things like making sure that in that governance structure, you have program managers. And I'll go through this in more detail a little bit later as well. But the next area here is right-sizing that future state by function in terms of staffing. So being able to understand, what is the future state need for this department? And if we know that there's going to be a 30% reduction in how much staffing is required, having that very deliberate plan of how you anticipate being able to get there, and just being able to share that with the staff, or taking into consideration things like seasonality, and when, let's say, for example, it's the beginning of the year and there's an eligibility process that you're running where typically you have to kind of staff up, taking those kinds of things into consideration if you don't necessarily need as many people that are going to be managing it. And then the last thing is just thinking about reskilling your resources. So things that other customers have focused on are doing things like job fairs, being able to share information about what others are doing in Rev Cycle, where there are openings, helping them understand what some of those different options may be, where they can expand their skill set, learn different areas, which should set them up better also to be in a supervisory position or a manager level position down the road, because they just understand more aspects in the revenue cycle and what's happening in other areas. A couple of things to consider, and this is another one of those leave behind slides you could just look through as you're thinking about your program. But first off, like, what is the communication strategy going to be to align the expectations of your program with really your organizational culture? Considering and preempting what some of those fears or questions may be from staff. Other things like how to handle your team's concerns. How are you creating those opportunities to upskill your staff to perform some of those more complex functions now that some of their time will be freed up? And then also creating that culture where it's in the staff's best interest to be really sharing ideas and creating buzz around how automation can actually make their lives easier and help lead to better outcomes, just become important considerations when you're building that. Going back to the thought of there's different phases of automation. So first off is information gathering. So that's before you officially kicked off your program and you're looking at different vendors versus kickoff, which is when you're actually starting your automation program, and then enterprise adoption is scaling it. So there's different internal requirements that you should be considering along each of those different phases. So for example, with information gathering, you want to make sure that you're getting those stakeholders involved from the beginning. One of the common pitfalls that I'll see is that there may be folks on the operations side that are really excited about using automation to help get more efficiency within their organization because they're having issues with staffing. So in those cases where it's more of an operations-led initiative and evaluating and vetting the different vendors, and then it gets to a decision point, and then IT is engaged, I've seen that cause significant slowdowns and hinders your ability to be able to successfully kind of launch your program. So I mentioned that to say that this should really be an effort that IT and operations are doing in tandem with each other, and you're engaging some of your IT leaders early on to be able to help evaluate the different vendors that you're looking into, what their capabilities are, what are going to be the IT requirements in order to get the program kicked off. So for example, are they going to be hosting in a different environment than what you're hosting? So hosting in the cloud, so that means you need to go through more security reviews. Things like that just become important for making sure that everybody is kind of aware of what is going to be needed to get the program started, and then understand the differences between each of those vendors that you're evaluating. Identifying the right resources. So it's typically best to have one person that is almost like a program manager that's leading the efforts to evaluate your different vendors and evaluate which processes are going to be the best. And then they kind of serve as the single point of contact on the provider side that are then working across several groups to coordinate the effort. So again, making sure you're finding the right person and allocating time for that person to really be dedicated to the assessment and can work across your organization to make sure all the right information is gathered. Other things like program kickoff. So again, in a couple slides here, actually the next one, we'll talk a little bit more about governance structure and what that could look like. But being able to review with the governance team, what are going to be expectations of them? Does it make sense for the kickoff to start with a specific group within Rev Cycle? So, or it could be, if you're thinking about it in more of an enterprise basis, is Rev Cycle the right area to get started to be able to start showing value and the returns that you can get from automation, and then go on almost like a roadshow to other areas in your org to show the benefit you've been able to achieve and be able to get them interested and willing to kind of participate in this broader automation program. Things like that just become important for getting the right stakeholders kind of aligned up front. Other things that when you're thinking about that enterprise adoption are getting alignment with those other department leaders. So let's say you're a VP of Rev Cycle, and that for some of the opportunities, there's going to be alignment with, let's say, your clinical leadership. I'll go back to authorizations, because in some in many organizations, there's maybe a centralized auth team that's handling things like radiology, for example, or more basic authorization requests, whereas the clinical departments are owning things like surgical auth. So being able to perhaps have, using this kind of concept of a pilot and scale, being able to pilot maybe with radiology in your centralized group and sharing the results and helping then those other leaders that are in the clinical departments understand, oh, wow, there is this great benefit that the rev cycle team's achieving in this scope that they're managing. Wouldn't it be great if we brought this over to our orthopedic surgery area or cardiology departments, so that way they can also reduce the amount of effort that's required on their side to have authorizations submitted and obtained. And then just doing things like expectation setting on time commitments. So how much time is going to be required for those that, if you're looking to scale this, and who are those different leaders across the org that you want to make sure you're engaging. So here's an example of a governance structure. There's a lot going on in here, and that's intentional. In order to have good governance, you really want to be very, I'll use the word deliberate again, and conscious about involving all the right people up front. That way you're able to really start the program off on a strong foot. So starting off with that executive steering committee. So that's typically being able to have a CFO and CIO and the VP of Revenue Cycle that are some of your executive sponsors that are leading the governance committee, and they're doing things like final approval on what the value is of those automations you're going to be running, or what is the roadmap and the priorities that you want to be working through. Then working with the team that is actually doing the process mining and the process build. The titles of these can vary a little bit based off of how you want to structure it, but the gist of what this group is doing is going out, knowing, first off, they should know which kind of processes are the best to automate. Being able to perform those business cases to be able to identify, how much opportunity do we expect to drive, doing the diligence to figure out how long it would take to build this, and helping to put that initial roadmap together. So you could think of this middle group, the process mining and build team, as kind of your core team that's doing most of the heavy lifting on a day-to-day basis. But then they're triaging and working with other groups, like it could be functional advisory committees. Let's say that you're doing this on a broader scale. They may be working with there's a denials task force, for example, to understand what are the root causes of most of your denials that we want to evaluate if it makes sense to do more automation. Or it could be within supply chain and understanding what are some of the invoice processing processes, or are they doing three-way matching for invoices, stuff like that. Where they're working with those advisory committees, where there's typically subject matter experts that are helping to kind of point the team in the direction of where they should be looking, or putting them in touch with folks that are owning the processes at the end of the day. That way they could be mapped out. And then having plugs into things like IT. So for example, there may be IT requirements where you have an extract that's needed in order to support a process, or need to get IT's approval in order to allow a bot to work on your EMR's user interface. Things like that are just important for having some of the collaboration. And then your maintenance team as well. So some teams may have the same groups that are doing the build and the maintenance. We like to actually kind of separate that out for a number of reasons, but making sure that that build team is plugged in with whoever's maintaining it. So that way your bots, they are being maintained, and they're getting smarter over time as well. So here's an example, and it's just, purely an illustrative example. It's not, the one size fits all way that you have to go, but typically you'll at least want to have, that one final executive sponsor. So who is it that at the end of the day is kind of making the final decision on which automations you want to be going with, giving the final seal of approval on what the automation is worth, helping to mitigate risk. So if there's challenges, let's say with not getting the right information from operational process owners, or let's say that there's an IT dependency, being able to work with that sponsor to help mitigate those risks. And usually we estimate maybe 10% or less of that person's time is going to be dedicated to supporting the automation program. Then we typically recommend having at least one dedicated program manager. If you're starting small and you're maybe just focusing on the front end of the revenue cycle, you may be able to get by with having a partially dedicated person there, but you'll want to have a program manager that is working closely with your automation team on vetting all the different processes and gathering all the requirements. Then having at least a couple of folks that are dedicated to running the assessment, designing the workflows, putting together process maps, helping to assist in creating those business cases so that way the team can make an informed decision on what are the automations that we should be prioritizing first. And then having a bigger team that's actually dedicated to doing the build and then the maintenance as well. So in this case, I kind of grouped them together. But perhaps having 5 people across those 2 different functions that are either building or maintaining. So those are going to be things like actually doing the build and then performing the user acceptance testing, for example, being able to monitor the automation so that way if something were to break that they're able to get to it in a timely fashion and able to resolve it. And also doing things like running analytics to figure out where are there opportunities to make the automation smarter over time, things like that. And then just, and those roles and kind of that middle bucket, you'd want to have them 100% dedicated to the program. And then last off, just making sure you understand that there are other stakeholders involved. So thinking back to this previous slide here with things like your IT groups or some of these functional advisory councils, legal and compliance is another group to be thinking about as well. To engage throughout the process. So just to kind of summarize that again, and really important to make sure you have just that robust change management program that's in place to support your automation journey. Other things like making sure you're getting the right level of buy-in and support from your team all the way up to the executive level is very, very important. So I've been talking for almost 50 minutes straight and want to wrap this up with a polling question before we open it up to the group for additional Q&A. So if we were to host a session with this group again, one thing that we'd be interested in learning just a little bit more about is, what would be that next topic that would be most interesting to you? I mean, is it understanding more specifically about other health systems and how they're using automation? Is it learning more about kind of this middle piece with the total cost of ownership and comparing kind of that build versus buy decision? Is it on the third piece with like, what are those different AI delivery models that you could be using as well? Curious to just understand that a little bit more from the group. So we'll give it a couple more seconds and then close the poll. All right, so it looks like most are interested in how others are using automation and AI. So thank you for your feedback there. Followed closely by understanding some of those AI delivery models a little bit better. So if we were to do this session again, and Lori and the Georgia committee were willing to let us come back, perhaps that's where we can focus, is maybe doing more of a case study and then talking more about those different delivery models. So we do have about 10 minutes left and wanted to open it up to the group for Q&A.
Okay, again, everyone, if you would just use the question and answer box, type in your questions there. Ross, here's the first question. Can you provide an example of a quick win process versus a more complex one that took longer to deploy?
Yes, good question. So examples of a process that would be more of a quick win is you could think about like claim status. And I'm going to be speaking more with respect to, I'll go back to the slide over here. I'll speak more with respect to kind of my experience both at Accenture as well as at Olive, but claim status is typically a little bit more turnkey. One thing you may be thinking about is, why do claim status with automation when there's already maybe an EDI transaction with the 276 and 277 you can do? The challenge with those 276 and 277s is that typically those responses that are coming back are more generic. So it requires staff to go onto the payer portals to get the more detailed insight on what is held up with that claim, or where is that claim sitting. So you can use automation in those cases to be able to go to the payer websites and scrape some of that information off of the screen, and then bring that back into your EMR and kind of prioritize the workload. So that way staff are only touching the accounts that they really need to touch. And if something is maybe pending payer processing and requires more time, being able to put those lower on the priority list, so that way they're not wasting that touch. But I'd say claim status is an example of one that is usually more of a quick win. You should be able to get that stood up, depending on your vendor, somewhere between 4 to 8 weeks. So that would be claim status. And then as an easier one, an extension of claim status would be automating denials. So let's say that as part of the claim status that you are seeing that there's an issue with the filing order. So there's the COB denial, coordination of benefits, and the way that it was submitted, let's say you had, I don't know, Aetna as a primary and Humana was secondary, but the correct filing order was the other way, Humana primary, Aetna secondary. A more complex automation you could do there that's an extension of claim status is being able to use a bot or AI capabilities to first off know and kind of interpret what that means with that COB denial in this instance. And second, being able to go into the user interface in the EMR to update the filing order and then resubmit the claim. Typically, any sort of automations that are going to require automating on the user interface are just going to be a little bit more complex and time intensive in nature, as opposed to automations where you're able to use things like APIs to be able to push information back into your EMR and not, kind of take an action using a bot. Good question, though.
Okay. Next question, what are the benefits of being focused on a larger enterprise strategy and approach as opposed to a point solution? Can you explain the benefits?
Yeah, I'd say that the biggest advantage is likely going to be the speed to value with going more of an enterprise-based approach. When you're going with a point solution, typically what's happening is, let's say it's more of just a pilot. So let's start off and kind of dip our toes in the water and do claim status, for example. So in that case, what you're typically doing is you're designing it with that one process in mind, and then you will see the benefits of that automation, and then it gets in the point of, okay, well, let's figure out how do we structure a contract and a program to be able to scale it. So when you're doing it on a point solution based approach, and let's say you're just doing, claim status, for example, you don't really need that robust change management governance structure. But if your plan is that you're going to go an enterprise approach anyways, then you're having to kind of pivot after the fact and then create that governance. And then after that, you're having to, again, create kind of that contracting vehicle to scope what all those different automations are going to be. So if you're starting off and knowing that you're going to do it from an enterprise-based approach, but still are going to pilot somewhere and then scale, that usually helps accelerate that speed to value of getting to more broad adoption. I mean, by at least 6 to 9 months, up to maybe even over a year for some organizations, because you're going in with that broader expectation up front, knowing that you're going to be scaling, as opposed to perhaps starting off and then going through a lot more hurdles to be able to get it to that next step.
Got it. Okay. I think that you actually answered the third question there in terms of do you recommend organizations start with a pilot before scaling? And it sounds like your answer is, it depends on, the end game. Is it, going to be just a point solution type of approach anyway, or is it truly enterprise?
That's exactly right. Yeah, and I guess one other thing I'd add on to that too is that it's common for organizations to request to do like a proof of concept. So you'll hear it being thrown around as a POC, or a proof of concept, and that's typically going to be in kind of that information gathering stage that I was referencing earlier. So I know that there's an importance of being able to evaluate different vendors, and then as part of that, one of the thoughts may be, well, let's do a proof of concept, and then each vendor runs their own proof of concept, and then we kind of compare results at the end of the day. I definitely strongly do not recommend doing a proof of concept, because I don't think that there's really going to be much that you learn about automation and RPA from the POC that you wouldn't be able to gather from speaking with references. POCs, they were more necessary, I'd say, probably about 18 months to 2 years ago, when RPA and automation was a lot less widely adopted. So there weren't a lot of references you could talk to. There weren't folks that would be able to say, yeah, I've worked with this so-and-so person or group, and they were able to provide this XYZ value. Now that there are, more established offerings that are in the marketplace, I would highly recommend not doing the POC, because it ends up being a little bit like comparing apples and oranges, because the way that the automations are built are going to look a little bit different across the different vendors that you are investigating. And then at the end of the day, that just adds in another step, getting access to run the POC. So usually that'll slow things down by a good 6 months, I guess, by doing it.
Got it.
So, and if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer it, but you can be strategic about asking the right questions and speaking with good references to be able to avoid having to go that POC route.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you. That's we don't have any other questions at this time. And this deck is really loaded with a ton of information here. So again, I would remind everyone that you can download it from the Georgia HFMA website. And if you don't see the link here in the chat box, I will be including it in the materials that I send out on Friday morning. Thanks everybody for participating in the webinar today, and thank you so much, Ross, for sharing your expertise. Our next webinar this month is going to be September 23rd. The topic is Major Workers' Compensation Legislation in Georgia. We have a virtual networking activity going on next week, and then also another one in October. And then speaking of October, we have a lot of activity gearing up next month. There's a payer forum that will be going on the week of October 12th, and Mactoberfest, Medicare Guidelines, October 21st to the 22nd. So please, again, be sure to check your events calendar on the Georgia HFMA website. Be on the lookout for those Georgia HFMA emails with more details and registration links. Ross, thanks so much again, and everybody, thanks for joining us today. Stay safe and have a great rest of the day. This concludes the webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.